The usual demand curve we've been working with shows how the quantity demanded varies as the price changes, holding everything else constant. So we hold the price of other goods and the income constant. This is also called the Marshallian or the uncompensated demand curve. However, there's a different kind of demand curve that you could draw, and this is going to relate to the idea of the substitution effect. So what we're going to do is to draw this compensated or Hicksian demand curve is to see how the quantity demanded varies as the price changes, but as we compensate the consumer for the increase in the price of the good. So we're going to keep them on the same indifference curve, and we're going to keep compensating them for the price increase so that they stay on the same indifference curve. So the uncompensated demand depends on the prices and the income, whereas the compensated demand depends on the utility level. So what we want to know is the indifference curve that you're on. So it depends on the prices and the utility level. It doesn't depend directly on your income because we're going to compensate you. We're going to make sure that you have enough income to get back to this utility level, this reference utility level U bar. Now, what we can't do is observe the compensated demand like we do observe uncompensated demand. So you can look at consumer data and observe the choices that consumers make and how that varies with the price, with changes in the prices. However, you can't observe the compensated demand because we don't know what people's utility levels are. So how would we graph this compensated demand? We've seen how to graph the uncompensated demand, so let's see how you would go about graphing the compensated demand. So let's start with the example we've seen before, where we have the price of good 1 is a half, and then that's our starting point. So we've got this budget line, and the slope is the price of good 2 we fixed at 1, and the price of good 1 we start at a half. So the budget line is going to have a slope of minus a half. It's minus P1 over P2. Now the consumer is going to demand some bundle there, and in the example we had seen before, the consumer is that bundle consists of 24 units of good 1. So when we had graphed the uncompensated demand, the way we did that was to draw this budget line and then have the consumer pick their favorite bundle, like this one right here, look at the quantity that they demand, mark here the price of good 1, and put the quantity of good 1 that they demand on the horizontal axis, and that gives us this point, capital E1, that corresponds to E1. That's how we found the uncompensated demand. Now, if we want to find compensated demand, what we're going to do is say, let's see what happens when the price goes up to 1. So if the price goes up to 1, if P1 equals 1, then the slope of the budget line is minus P1 over P2, which is minus 1 over 1, which is minus 1. So we would have a slope of minus 1 when the price of good 1 goes up to 1. So if we want to make sure that the consumer stays on the same indifference curve, we would have to compensate them so that they come back to this indifference curve and they would consume some bundle like E2. So again, we put 1 and whatever the quantity that they consume at this bundle E2, put that here, and that gives us this point, capital E2. Similarly, let's suppose the price drops further. Suppose the price of good 1 goes to a quarter. Then minus P1 over P2 is minus 0.25 divided by 1, which is minus 0.25, which is negative a quarter. So again, we would get a budget line of this slope, and we would compensate the consumer again so that they would come back to the same budget line. So to the same indifference curve. So they consume this bundle E3. Again, that consists of this quantity of good 1. So we put this quantity of good 1 with add quarter to get this point, capital E3. We do this for every possible price to get this curve. That's the compensated demand curve. Now there are some things to note. Remember, when we found this point, capital E1, we would have done exactly the same thing to find the uncompensated demand curve. So the uncompensated demand curve is also going to pass through this particular point. However, the uncompensated demand curve is going to be flatter than the compensated demand curve. In other words, the uncompensated demand is going to respond to price even more than the compensated demand. So if we go from the price 1/2 to 1, the compensated demand only decreases from 24 to this point, whereas uncompensated demand is going to decrease all the way to here. So why is this uncompensated demand flatter? It's because it includes not only the substitution effect, but also the income effect. Whereas the compensated demand only tells us about the substitution effect. So for a normal good, the uncompensated demand is going to be a flatter curve than the compensated demand. So like I said on the previous slide, the uncompensated demand curve is going to cross the compensated demand curve at the original bundle E1, because we don't have to compensate the consumer to get to the original indifference curve at that point. And we've also seen that the compensated demand curve is steeper because this is a normal good, and the compensated demand only reflects substitution and not income effect.